Hello everyone and welcome to the 8th edition of the webinar series run by the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. We've had a lot of speakers come in the past and talk about different aspects of sales, and today we have the privilege of having one of Ball State's alumni, Phil Keene, come and share with you some of his thoughts on the concept of inside sales, and he's going to shed more light into what inside sales is and what it is not, and how it is becoming something that a lot of people should be considering as a good career choice, and organizations should be looking at in terms of developing that function as well. Phil Keene actually graduated from here. He's now the sales director at a company called Renaissance Electronic Services. Is that correct, Phil?
Yeah, correct.
Absolutely. And
RES for short. We'll keep it
RES
short.
for short, indeed. So, and he's going to share with you some of his insights. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to come out here.
It's always good to get back to Muncie, Indiana, and enjoy Ball State and the Akron campus. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. So Phil, one of the things which the reason why I have you here is that I was pretty impressed with the way you and a team of your like-minded individuals and professionals organize things around inside sales professionals. And I had an opportunity to see how you shared some of your thoughts and your passion, and I thought it would be great for you to have you over here on this, and in continuation of some of the topics that we've discussed in the past. Yeah. So in the past, one of the topics that we had discussed was actually the concept of how digital marketing is actually reshaping the whole sales function and the sales process itself. And we had a professor, Eric Harvey, who was talking about statistics like 57% of a business-to-business buying decision is made before they talk to a sales rep, and then of course what impact it has on marketing. We also had people talk about how increasingly sales managers are struggling to increase the efficiency of the sales force. That is, they need to get more output, but they don't have as many resources, and they're looking at ways by which they can have a broader reach to the customers, but also be efficient in the process. And I heard the term inside sales come up quite a lot. And since I saw you presenting, so I thought, why not have you here and discuss that as well? So in the digital age right now, Phil, what is the role, what is an inside salesperson?
Yeah, so I think we even unpack it, kind of what you're talking about right there, of like this digital sales transformation, the digital marketing transformation, and what it did to the marketplace first, and then why it even switched us to the inside sales world. So if you look at the digital marketing world over the last 20 some odd years, and you look at cloud-based CRM like a Salesforce.com or the many others that are out there as well, it's we have this database, this massive database that is now exists in our world, and we can now have this volume of just running through things really quickly, and we can be pretty educated in the conversations we're having with those people at a pretty quick rate. We also have this partnership now with digital marketers and people that are pulling these leads in, people that actually want to raise their hand and have a conversation with us, the 57% stat that you recommended or talked about. So that's changing, and I think it's the context behind why it's changing is people they buy differently. So if you look at Uber and Amazon and even now when I get my groceries, I click a list in an app and then I go grab them. How I act as a consumer is now changing the B2B space as well, and it's forcing us to act quicker, and people want this instant gratification. So it's forcing us into this function because that's what the buyer wants. We're moving into the buyer's journey of where they want to head. It's also just more cost effective from a company perspective. You could hire more bodies and pay them a decent wage and not have to worry about buying a company car. You and I had the conversation off of afterwards, like not buying the company car. You don't have to spend money on all of the other expenses with travel and all of that. So you even see traditional field-based companies now that are even taking some inside sales tactics to make their team more efficient and more effective at what they're doing. So I think that's the whole transition. That digital marketing world and that the consumerization of the B2B world is really forcing us into this. And there's some laggards that are out there that haven't made the change yet, but I think ultimately a lot of people will make this transition.
Indeed. On
top of that, we've also had technology that supports it as well. Indeed. So it's really easy for me to Skype you or webinar in and do WebEx and all the webinar softwares that are out there for us to have a real face-to-face conversation with the click of a button on my laptop, and now we're sitting next to each other. So I think that's what's forcing us into the inside sales function.
Absolutely, but from what I hear, but inside sales is much more than just that talk, right? I know that you know much more about this. That's what was really triggered my interest. What triggered my interest is absolutely, so you mentioned something that is pretty interesting, is that even external sales forces now, because of things like Skype or FaceTime, they can do the face-to-face over technology. But SDR, the concept of inside sales, SDR, sales development reps, is much more than that. And even the concept of trying to get your leads engaged with you and trying to make sure that before we even have that face-to-face, either physically or technology-wise, you need to get the interest of the buyers, who increasingly are saying, I don't necessarily want to see a salesperson, but how do I? So essentially, I think that for me is what is really, really is amazing in the fact that organizations right now are looking into these kind of things. And I was recently in a presentation where a Fortune 200 company actually said, historically known for using external sales, now actually saying that for all of the new hires, if they do not do an internal gig, gig, that you would not necessarily go into an external force. And I think that is what I think is very, very interesting in terms of how technology is making it happen, but the buying behaviors of customers are also happening there as well. So now, when I talk about people that I come in contact with, when I talk about internal sales, for them it's mostly about order fulfillment. That is, you have an external person go out there, get the sale, and then the inside person then make sure they put it into the system and follow it up after that. Is that what inside sales is, or is it much more than that?
Yeah, so it's transforming into a much more full cycle sale now. I see companies that have people that will do it from front to back, which means I take the lead in and I actually close the deal, and I even manage them as a customer once they become a customer. That's not as likely in a scenario. There's also very highly specialized organizations, which when I talk about specialization is they have certain tasks that they're asked to do and do it well, and every function adds to the other functions. So you'll hear terms like SDR, which is Sales Development Representative. Other names for that is BDR, which is Business Development Representative, ADR, ISR, whatever it is at the end of the day, whatever that acronym. Their function really is to prospect and generate interest. Whether it's somebody that came as an inbound lead through digital marketing where they said, I want to talk to you, you're there qualifying the conversation. And then there's the, I might even just outbound, which is more of, I'm going to physically cold call you. Maybe I want to do a little bit of research first and understand you and your world and your problems. And then I want to talk to you about that. And then I want to qualify you and get you on to the next level. That usually goes to an account executive or an AE for short. You can also notice like a sales executive or many other nomenclatures. And that there's even specializations inside of those that go deeper into like more complex deals, more like key account executives, which could even be external a little bit. It's just understanding what that flow looks like into the account executive. And then there's even a layer after that, which is not necessarily, it's kind of a lateral movement from an AE, which is the account management role or client success role in a lot of like a SaaS-based business. So there's these specializations to, one, take care of the customer across whatever part of the journey they're at. So for me, inside sales is how do we meet the customer where they want to be and get to where they want to be and help walk them through that journey together and kind of walk side by side. So
that's very interesting. So essentially what you're saying is that the customer journey would also actually fit together with the different parts and roles that inside sales has to play. So essentially what you're saying is that there are different roles, and depending upon the kind of products that you're selling or services that you're selling, you have different roles as well. Correct. So typically what would be the profile of an inside salesperson who's responsible for prospecting and generating leads, for example?
So a profile that I will typically hire for is, I want somebody that's a learner. So that's first and foremost is educate yourself. So if you're probably watching this webinar, you're probably going to school for sales, that's probably a good thing. You're a learner you want to know your craft and you know that this is a skill set that you're building. So you're looking for a learner. You need someone that's gritty, that's able to hear no with some velocity behind things. It's one of the things that I like most about the inside sales world, the SDR role, is you get to go learn how to be told no and kind of become immune to it and work through that in a pretty protected environment. So you got to be gritty, you got to be able to fight through a lot of that. And then really the third thing is are you able to be somewhat influenced or somewhat persuasive? And it's getting them to people to buy in, even though there's not the one-to-one communication face-to-face. It's more of using your words and how you're using your words and how you communicate. There's a lot of psychology behind it, and there's a lot of like puzzle pieces you're putting together at that time. So that's what really intrigues me about the inside sales world today.
Indeed. And I think one of the things for the audiences out here is that when I saw one of the presentations that I was invited to by Phil, we had a person who had done 13,000 calls.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine the staggering amount of no's. It was a he in this case, he must have received. And I think what you're actually saying is that actually it's a good kind of a learning ground for young professionals who want to go into sales to get trained on what it means to actually get a rejection on your face. And when I heard that, what struck me was that how incredibly mentally strong the inside sales, who is successful, of course, have to be, because of course in external sales you're going to have no's, rejections, of course, but by the time you get a rejection and go to the next person, you're not going to deal with as much, whereas with a phone, typically they just bang the phone down on you. I mean, not bang, today with mobile phones you don't bang the phone, but so for me, that was what was really amazing, is the amount of mental strength you need to have to do that in terms of doing that. Of course, you need to have a learning mentality, but you should also be very tenacious. You should really be able to hang on to it as well. Now, you mentioned something that was very, very interesting. So you mentioned about the fact that a lot of things is made about how you have non-verbal communication and all this, looking at body language that we have when we're looking at external sales. Now, how was that translate in an inside sales function? How would you gauge the kind of the emotions of the person on the other end of the phone? Of course, Skype, I can understand, you can see a little bit.
Yeah.
But
so you remove that third level, that the body language that communicates so much. So you have to start to listen to things like tone, and you have to hear how they're talking. What's the rate they're talking? In a certain sense, you have to take on some of those characteristics to even adjust the conversation for them. So also, it's outside of that, you have to listen to the words they're saying. So if someone says, "I'm frustrated by that," you have to listen for that. You have to be really, really triggered into that. Or if they say, "Yeah, that's pretty much what it's like," that's not a definitive answer. So it's how do you unpack that one thing they said and listen for it in detail. Inside sales professionals have to be much better listeners.
wow, yeah,
In the conversation, because when someone says pretty much, there's a detail there that you can go deeper on. Where it's, hey, so you said pretty much.
indeed.
What could be better?
What could be better?
Right? Well, how could that get better? How could you improve that? So you're listening to those words to really just adjust your conversation and go layers and layers deeper in your dialogue that you're having. So I think that's one that a lot of people, it's tone and it's the words specifically that they're saying and adjusting your conversation based off what they're saying.
It's amazing. Actually, the more I hear you say this, the more I'm convinced that anybody who's got to go into external sales has to spend some time in internal sales, because I remember when we teach a class on sales, we tell our students there's a reason why we have one mouth and two ears. Now, it's not necessarily put into practice, but I guess in an internal sales, the ears play a much more important role. Either that or you're going to be confronted with a no, mostly because you do not pay enough attention. So I think it's really, really interesting from that perspective. So let's go back into the concept of SDRs, right? You have SDRs, and then you have the SDR sales development reps or internal sales reps and things like that. Now, if you take a look at that function, typically what kind of key performance indicators do you use to see whether they're performing well or not?
Yeah. So in a lot of organizations, it varies in a couple different places. So it's more of, there's always a KPI that's whatever the transition is. What's the thing that hands it off to the next person in the equation? So oftentimes a lot of people are tasked with things like, did you set a demo? Or it was it successful or not? It could be things like, just set a meeting, maybe not even to show the software off, but just set the meeting and let me know that this is qualified enough to have a real dialogue. It could be something like, how many dials did you make today? Which I don't love the idea of like just how many dials are you pushing and pushing and pushing. I prefer to have purposeful dials. If I'm gonna pick the phone up and call, there's a reason. It just adjusts the KPI based off whatever that next level is typically. What I do love is the concept of know your numbers. And this is hard because a lot of people don't grasp this way or think this way early enough in their career. So for you to be successful, what are the things you need to do to be successful? So do you need to make X amount of phone calls to have X amount of conversations? If you have X amount of conversations, it means I can book this many meetings. If I book this many meetings, it means I have this many closed deals. You should know your conversion ratio for each of those levels. That way, whenever you tell me, hey, I need you to hit your number this month, you can immediately go back to the behaviors you know that work and make that many calls, to have that many conversations, to have that many meetings set, which mean that you hit your number. So there's a concept of you knowing your number and know how that works. But those are the elements of things I would start to look at.
But Phil, it's interesting that you talk about this as well. Well, there are many interesting things you say, but for me, the key to a successful inside sales job then has to be an inside sales manager, right? Because you cannot expect a newbie coming in out there and know exactly how to do these calculations. But if the field is new, in your opinion, how kind of qualified are the inside sales managers? Because if it's a new field, sales management is the last thing that gets trained on it. You just give a lot of training to your inside sales, but not the manager. So in your opinion, what should inside sales managers be looking at in terms of what kind of knowledge should they gain, and how would they go about learning all these kinds of stuff?
Yeah, so one, I think there's more than enough resources out in the world. If you just Google search whatever it is that you're looking for. What I actually do, and what I did early in my career as a sales manager in the inside sales world, was I would diary it. Like I would sit there and I would write out the problem that existed in my world, and I would start talking to myself and having that conversation, and I would go seek some kind of resource to help me. Whether it was as a person that's been through it, experienced it, or something I found online that was a webinar, and I would deploy it. And the wonderful thing about inside sales is you can try things quickly. And you have enough volume typically behind it that you know if it works pretty quickly. So that was a big adjustment I made right away. Was I started to diary to myself, and then it actually turned into blog content eventually of like, I know this problem exists in your world because it existed for me. And then that turned into me writing content that people related to, which got me a bigger name and a better brand and all the other things that related back to it, and that was not ever the purpose for it. The purpose for me was always just, I had this internal struggle and I needed a way to work through it, and I didn't know who else to turn to yet, so it was me just kind of talking to myself. And then it was, let's go seek advice from other people that have been there before.
That's true, but when did you start doing this? So was it 3 years ago, 4 years ago when you started writing this down and stuff like that?
This is probably now, I mean, in the inside sales capacity, about 7 years ago.
So which is very interesting, because a lot of companies still, if they have to look into or start beginning to consider inside sales roles, they think about recruiting people, but they're not necessarily thinking about getting the managers up to speed on it.
Yeah.
And I think I cannot stress enough how important it is for your inside sales force to be successful.
Yeah.
If you don't set the right KPIs, if you don't set the right ways of motivating them and give them the right kind of training, your inside sales management becomes even more critical in that way as well. And the fact that you did it yourself, I'm hoping that at the end of the call we'll have your blog post that can be shared as well. Yeah. Now, you have the inside sales, right? So essentially then you talked about account executives, right? Now, how does a handover take place? So is it like a smooth handover, both from the viewpoint of from the SDR's perspective as well as from the customer's perspective? Because the customer has spoken to somebody, and now they have to talk to somebody else. How do you deal with that as well?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the organization, and depends on the velocity you run at, depends on your contract value, it depends on how much you want to give the responsibility to the SDR or sales development rep. So I think those are the factors that play into what happens next. I've had organizations with larger, more complex type sales where they sat on the call with the account executive the first time and made the introductions, and here's what we talked about, and there was this nice, easy relationship transition. I even work at organizations, or have worked at organizations, where it's a lot more transactional, where they have a conversation, they're qualified enough, we're good to go, take the next step. I think we'll go back to an analogy to make it really, really simple for people. So when I think of the SDR world, I think most SDRs are either an usher or they're a bouncer. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times with SDRs is, hey, you want to talk to us? Come on, I'll show you the table, we'll sit down. Versus if they change their lens and their view on what they're talking about and how they're talking to people, it's more of, hey, based off these things, you can't come in. You can't have this meeting with this account executive. And I feel if you take the bouncer lens instead of the usher lens, a lot of the turmoil or the friction that happens between an SDR and AE will usually be eliminated, because they know that you've done enough to at least qualify this person out if they shouldn't be having the conversation. So it's how do you get to know quicker? Once you get to know quicker and you want to keep passing things along, just solve for the next step. So in the SDR world, it's really a lot of scenarios. It's I want a demo or a discovery call. And you guys can call it all sorts of different things in your organization. I've heard them called orientation calls and all these other things. But solve for the next meeting, which is the introduction meeting where we get to know you. And then possibly even introduce you to what we do. So from there, it's handed off usually fully to the account executive to run and own until they sign off to be a customer. And in some organizations, even past that, where it's a year or two after, they still own them as a client.
So what I'm taking from this, Phil, is the fact that, of course, it's going to depend on what you're trying to sell, the sales cycle, the sales process, and everything else. So one of the things that I hear a lot is the concept of sales enablement, that is enabling your team. Does it apply only to external sales, or do you also have sales enablement for your internal sales folks as well?
Yeah, so sales enablement in general, I think has to be done for everyone. And the good thing about inside sales now is that the foundational things that you're learning today in inside sales, if you ever have the opportunity now in the future to do field-based sales or even key account executive type of roles that are inside sales-based roles, but still travel a little bit, there's foundational things you need to learn. The one thing I like about the SDR role specifically that leads into an account executive role is you got to go try some of these things that you've learned either through a university or now you're learning kind of for the first time and through a sales trainer or even from the sales trainer internally. Go in to apply that. And you're starting to learn some of the concepts. You're starting to learn, how do I listen to this person and hear the things that are issues with them, or how do they communicate it? What are the problems? Really, sales in general the simplest level is all about pattern recognition. It's about, I've heard this scenario, I know how to help you. I've heard this scenario, this is likely the path. It's this path or this path. What's the most relevant to you? So it's just a series of pattern recognition, so you hear it over and over again, and then you know how to respond. So the SDR role gives you the ability to build a lot of that pattern recognition, that mental model that you need to be successful in the rest of your career forever. I've also seen people that get into that first role as a sales development rep and go into marketing, or go into somebody that's like an account management type of role, or something that's not a traditional path where I'm going to go sell, because they might find out that sales is not for me. If you ever want to be a CEO of a startup in a company, like, you got to learn how to prospect. You got to learn how to build your own pipeline, your own interest. If you can't do that, you'll fail as a company. So I think there's a lot of benefits to learning the SDR role and being really successful with that.
So which means that enablement is not just for externals. It's actually, if you begin with an internal sales, you're actually enabling them for the future as well. It's just not enablement to be successful there on the job itself. Well, so essentially, if you start talking, so you mentioned something which I have to ask, because everybody asks me that question, is you say recognizing patterns. Now we talk about AI, right? Now I see some pretty cool things happening out there. And to what extent actually is AI more relevant to an inside salesperson, because you're constantly talking to customers, you're constantly hearing things, and you said the volume is much more because you have a larger base. To what extent is AI shaping that role as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have, because you can go really deep on like, what could it do, what's it going to be responsible for. I think there's always going to be a place for really good sales professionals that have the ability to have a dialogue, whether it's face to face or just over the phone or over Skype or whatever it is. So there is going to be always a place for that sales professional, because I think as human beings, a lot of times we need it. We want the human interaction. Sales a lot of times is a transfer of trust outside of pattern recognition. So it's me giving you information to make you trust me, help you trust me, and help us come to a conclusion together that we agree is the right option for us. Like, that's a lot of what sales is about. So AI can do elements of it. AI is great at pattern recognition over time. I've also seen a lot of times, like, AI right now, at least today as it currently sits, is it's still awkward. It's still off. It's still writing emails that were 3 years ago kind of worked that don't really work today. And part of it's the human is changing so fast as well and adapting to the types of things that are happening around them that they adjust. So when the human adjusts, AI needs to adjust again. So right now, I don't know if it's fast enough to catch up to that. I think it will be. I think there's something in 10 years from now, or 5 years from now.
Because I was not, if you're talking about emails, wow, I was not even aware of it. I was talking more about the line, say for example, I'm talking to a customer. Right? Now typically when we look at external sales, what we talk about is, we call it the feel, felt, found. I understand how you feel. You look at patterns, other people have felt the same way, and this is what they found out. But what happens is, because of the sheer volumes and stuff happening, can technology come and say, okay, if this is the kind of questions you're going to be expecting, these are the kind of responses you need to give. I'm not talking in terms of shooting emails. For me, that is one step that I cannot comprehend. But do you see that happening in helping salespeople recognize those patterns? Because one salesperson might be talking to one and might have limited, what can I say, might have had limited exposure to internal sales, but that does not mean that the company does not have a treasure trove of information that can then be fed into the system so that a new person can quickly hit the ground running rather than having to go through learning it, and then that increases the efficiency. So do you see that going forward, actually improving the internal sales role?
I could probably think of right now about a dozen companies that are doing that. So they're out there in the world and they're trying to use AI to prep you with an answer. Or, hey, I heard this about a competitor, deliver the information right there in front of you and put it at your fingertips. It's an interesting concept. It has not been executed well yet. I think there's a lot of more companies that aren't even taking an AI approach, more of just have a library of content first, which is, let's get that content in the right place, get it at your fingertips, get used to using it, and then eventually I think there'll be companies that will do really well. Like, I heard this, I'm going to push it to you. There's some really impressive companies out there that are doing some fun stuff with AI when it comes to the actual dialogue that are happening. Delivering content, nobody's really got there yet. I think there's some companies that are going to be close. I still think that's probably 2 or 3 years until it really clicks and pops, where people are like, yep, this actually works and I can prove it. But it's definitely happening. It's out there in the world for sure.
Well, Phil, we've been having a lot of great conversation right now, but I'm afraid that at this point in time, we will have to cut it short at this point in time. So thank you again, Phil, for coming out here, but I'm sure that we'll continue the conversation and we'll have part 2 of the same webinar as well. So the audience, again, Phil has been kind enough to grace us with his presence today, and stay tuned for part 2 of the webinar and a continuation of the discussion we've had so far. Thank you again, Phil.